Great to see everybody tonight. We are Luke chapter 24, and we are slowly starting to finish up Luke's record of the gospel account of Jesus. It's kind of fascinating when you think about the fact that of the four gospel accounts, you get two accounts that come from men who served as what? As apostles, right? You get Matthew and John's record of the life of Jesus based on their very intimate and direct contact with Him. And they would have had a very different kind of insight. I think in some ways when you go back and you read the narratives, you can almost kind of sense it, right? You read Matthew's record and you read John's record, and it almost seems like there's this greater sense of detail and different aspects that we don't necessarily get the same sense from Mark and Luke, who undoubtedly were disciples and believers in Jesus, but they generally, when it came to specific things that happened between Jesus and His apostles, had to get that information how? Two ways, right? By talking to those who did encounter it and through the inspiration of God to ultimately bring that message. And so we've been working through Luke's record. While we went through the account of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, I spent a lot of time showing you some charts. We examined all of the gospel accounts as it relates to that aspect of the narrative as we looked at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I'm not going to do that from here on out as we finish up the chapter. Just let me acknowledge that I know that there's a whole lot of other things that happen that Luke just doesn't record. He doesn't record the interaction with Thomas. There are events and moments from the resurrection forward that Luke just doesn't record for us. We'll pick those up another time. I think we're ready to kind of finish up our study of the book of Luke in between tonight and maybe Sunday to completely wrap it up. But so rather than bounce you back and forth, I'm going to just stick to what Luke records as it relates to Jesus' time spent after His resurrection. And we witnessed that scene where various ones end up at the tomb. First, some ladies end up there, which they got there intending to be there, right? They on purpose followed Joseph of Arimathea to where that tomb was. They witnessed how it was laid out, where it was. They witnessed the stone that was placed across that opening, because we know that from, not Luke's record, but from other records, that as they're traveling to the tomb on the first day of the week, they're having a conversation about how they're going to what? Yeah, how are we going to get the stone out of the way when we get there, and then all of those events that unfold before them, and we talked about those at length over the past several class periods. And so get that scene back into your mind. So Jesus is risen. We have witnesses to an empty tomb. Luke doesn't record the encounter with Mary Magdalene, which others do, but he just kind of begins this process of talking to us about Jesus' encounter with whom? Two men heading down towards Emmaus. What? Say it again. I'm sorry. I thought I heard. Oh, okay. I apologize. I thought I heard something else come from. Okay. So that as they're traveling, we learn in verse 18 that one of them is named what? Cleopas. And I didn't have time Sunday. I was asked about this on the way out of the building. I'll share a quick couple of thoughts with you as it relates to him. Do we know anything else about him? I'll ask the question first. I don't think so. Judy knows me well enough to know that I would never have asked that question if we don't have something else that we might be able to at least point to. Let me share a couple of texts with you real quick. Let's start in Mark chapter 3. I've got Luke 24 up, but let me start with you in Mark chapter 3 in verse 18. And see if we can't draw a picture here. So, in Mark chapter 3 and verse 18, this is just that listing of the apostles, right? Mark's record of that. And notice that he says, and Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James, which we generally refer to that James as James the Less, the son of Alphaeus. Okay. Keep that in your minds. Go to John chapter 19. I'm just going to share a couple of texts with you and see if we can't connect the dots a little bit. So John chapter 19, verse 25. And again, I'll show it to you on the screen. So at at the crucifixion, in verse 25 of John's record of chapter 19, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, and her name was Mary. It is. So Mary, she is the wife of Cleopas. Most believe this is the same guy. So this Mary, the wife of Cleopas, it's got an H in it in John's record, but generally believed that that man that she was married to and the man that's on his way to the road to Emmaus is the same Cleopas. And then let me add one more text with you, Matthew 27. Matthew chapter 27 and in verse 56. So, there's a general belief that Alphaeus, that we read from in Mark 3, verse 18, and Cleopas are one and the same. And notice in Matthew's record of those ladies that were there, now it's Mary, the mother of James, right, but that's James the Less that we already read about in Mark's record as well in this moment. So, piecing it together. If it's accurate that Mary is married to Cleopas, John 19:25, and she is the mother of James the Less, in both those texts that we read at the beginning and end, in Mark chapter 3 and in Matthew 27, she's noted as the mother of James the Less. Cleopas is noted as her husband in John 19, verse 25, and Alphaeus is noted as the father of James the Less in Mark chapter 3 and verse 18. So, draw an arrow, right? So the mother of James the Less is Mary, the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The father of James the Less is Alphaeus. But John's record of Mary, the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, is Cleopas. So it's not uncommon for men to have multiple identifying names. We've got that within the apostles, right? Where they'll be recognized by one name in one moment and another. And so connecting the dots, I would argue fairly that Cleopas, John 19:25, and Alphaeus in Mark 3:18 have most likely got to be the same individual, because John 19:25 says that's the husband of Mary, who in two narratives is said to be the mother of James the Less, the sister to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So, all that said, that generically then, if all that pans out to be accurate, then he's technically what to Jesus? He's his uncle. He would be his uncle by marriage. Now, the only reason I'm cautious about some of that, and I think we can certainly make some connections because the narrative clearly says it, but as what happens anytime there's multiple names for the same individuals, then secular history will just run amok and just start making things up that they think might be possible. Because anyway, so if you start doing some genealogical history and relationship, just beware that if you Google it, you're going to get some really odd and interesting extrapolations from what we do know. What we do know is there was a guy named Cleophas who was said to be the husband of Mary, the mother of James the Less. That same guy was named Alphaeus, when the recording of the apostles was listed. And if that be the case, and this Cleopas that's on the road to Emmaus is the same individual as well, then you've got the uncle of Jesus that he's encountering, which makes that interesting because he didn't what? He doesn't recognize him. Now, that's maybe somewhat intentional. Jesus is doing some interesting things in his immediate time after his resurrection, but it is interesting to note that even one who was family can have some challenges recognizing who Jesus was as they're on the road to Emmaus. And I get it, it's hard, right? You've got two Marys that are apparently sisters, both with the same name.
There stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. At least that's the way mine is grammatically put out, which would be mother, his mother's sister, a lady named Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene.
And I would not argue that that's not an impossibility. Here's the only reason why I would hesitate because of the way they're naming specifically and identifying specifically. But it could be. You could be talking about a completely different individual who is the sister to Mary, who is not. So all that does to our narrative is erases the idea of him being his uncle. You're still dealing with the same individuals and the same. The only thing that might do is if it breaks that to make her not the actual sister to Mary, the mother of Jesus, then the only thing that does is breaks that narrative of whether this is his family member or not.
Would they name two sisters Mary?
Well, I mean, think about it. Right here, you've got Mary, the mother of Jesus. You've got Mary, Cleopas, whether she's a sister or not, we'll leave for another discussion. You've got Mary Magdalene, and within the narratives also, you have Mary, the sister to Lazarus and Martha. All of them within the script. So I don't know whether it would have been completely uncommon or not for that to happen, for them to be identified by the same name. Unusual, I suppose, would be accurate to that. But again, that's why I'm asking the questions, right? And we're just kind of walking through it as it relates to these individuals. So I believe that's absolutely possible, that you've got one more individual standing there, in other words. Fair enough. Any other thoughts or questions? Things you came across? And again, if you read, and that's the thing I say, you got to read it out a little bit, because you just go to a commentary and they're just going to tell you whatever historical backdrop they believe in as it relates to it. But the question came up after class last week, so I thought I'd at least pursue it for half a minute, and I gave it 15. But anyway, no, that's not your fault. That's my fault. I brought it up. So let's move into where we left off then Sunday. So they've gone through this process, and I couldn't figure out why I'm not seeing what I should see. It's because I'm still in John. So as they're traveling, Jesus makes some interesting questions, right? He asks them, what are y'all so sad about and talking about? And Cleopas kind of says, where have you what? Where have you been? What do you mean, what are we talking about? Where have you been? Are you the only stranger in all of Jerusalem that's coming out of that location that has no idea what's happened? And then he begins to basically say, there was this great what? There's this great prophet. And he came to the people and did great things. And for some reason, even despite the mighty deeds and works and the word that poured forth from him and the delight the people seemed to have in him initially, our chief priests and rulers decided to deliver him to be condemned of death, and they've crucified him. But we trusted that it had been in he which should have redeemed Israel, and beside all this, today is the third day since these things were done, and yea, and certain women also of our company made us astonished, which were early at the sepulchre, and when they found not his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels, which said that he was alive. So, at this point, I don't know how else to describe these guys except they don't know what to believe right now. That's kind of where they're at. We thought this one we'd been waiting for was going to usher in a new era of Israel. It's been 3 days and we haven't heard anything from him. Maybe some of that is some of their recollection of his conversation about, and in 3 days, right? And we haven't encountered him. All we know is that some ladies went to the sepulcher, and when they got there, it was empty. And when they came back, they told us about some angels, and you almost hear this, this subtle disbelief in their voice. They told us that they had these, what they call them, visions of angels. I think that's the language of somebody who just is not so sure what he believes about what happened. Because those weren't visions of angels. What were they? Yeah, real actual moments that they encountered. Not just a vision like they were asleep and got it in a dream, like Peter eventually will get some things later on. But I'm just trying to draw the picture for you that these men are uncertain about what they should do with the knowledge and information they've been given thus far. But they're telling us he's alive. And that then they went there, they didn't find him. And what's Jesus' 25? Yeah, he's pretty direct, right? He's pretty direct in that he says, "Then said unto them, O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." One of the most challenging things I think Jesus becomes disappointed in at times, if that's a fair word. At times with the Pharisees, he calls them what? Over and over again? Hypocrites, right? He calls them hypocrites multiple times. And part of that was because they had all the knowledge and information to draw the right conclusions about who Jesus was and refused to do it. And that seems to frustrate Jesus more often than not. When people who should know better but still don't respond to what it is they understand to know. I think that's what he feels like in front of these folks. They're talking about all of these events and circumstances as if there's this level of impossibility about it. How could any of this actually have happened? That's kind of their mindset, right? None of this could be true. And he says, you're foolish and you're slow of heart. You ought to be able to connect the dots quicker than this, to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and enter into his glory? Do you fellows know what the prophets wrote about Jesus or not? Do you know what they said would happen to him, how he would suffer, the kinds of things he would suffer, and the timing in which those events? Did you not have all of the back information you needed to draw the right conclusions about who Jesus is and what he was going to accomplish and how it was going to be accomplished? He's frustrated because even those who were close to him, regardless of whether this is a relative or not a relative, this man was close enough to have been witness to many of the things that had been going on. And they're just not getting it. And just not opening their hearts to it. Go ahead, Amy.
Still expecting that physical kingdom and not understanding the spiritual.
Yeah. It is still ingrained in their thinking that all of that history was about a restoration of the nation. And to this moment, they're still struggling with that as it relates to these men that he's speaking to on this occasion. And the disappointment, again, that had to have brought.
The Romans have controlled them so much, they can't get away from them.
Well, and I think that you're right, Jim. I think because of a lot of the oppression, if you will, and the challenges they had being subjects to another nation, kind of led them to want that restoration of the people as a physical nation. And it lent itself towards that end. Yet, if they had simply thought through the prophets and the things shared with them, they would have understood more clearly, and should have, according to Jesus in this text. So what's Jesus do? Yeah. So what Jesus does, he just goes back to Moses. He says, all right, you're struggling with this. Let's make sense out of it. Right? Let's go back as far as we need to in order to make sure that you can grasp what's happening here. And beginning at Moses, that's interesting, right? Because he could have started where? Yeah, it could have backed up clear to Abraham. I think maybe he jumps back to Moses because they understood that a promise was made to Abraham. They just didn't have clarity as to what it was about, right? They knew there had been a great promise made to Abraham. Their problem is they didn't have the clarity as to what they should have understood about those promises made to Abraham. So he just takes them to Moses. Let's start there. We can give you clarity if we start there. And so he begins at Moses and all the prophets, and he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And they drew nigh unto the village whither they went, and he made as though he would have gone further. So they're traveling, they're talking, he's teaching them from the time of Moses through the prophets, helping them understand all of that history as it pointed to Jesus and what was going to occur with him. They get to Emmaus, where they're intending to go. He says, or gives them the implication, I'm going to keep going, right? If you guys, this is your stop, okay, I'm going to keep going. But what do they ask him to do? All right, so they ask him to stay. In fact, they didn't, in some ways, just ask. And King James Version says they constrained him. The idea is here, they're not taking no for an answer. They want him to stay, and they're doing everything they can to make sure that he abides with us, for it's getting late. Wasn't necessarily the safest thing to be doing, to be traveling in the dark of night. We've been walking quite a while, right? Emmaus is roughly 7 miles, I believe, in our terms, from Jerusalem to Emmaus, if I'm recalling that correctly. And I'm going off the top of my head of my memories in my studies because I didn't write it down. But I think that's about right. And initially, you might think, wow, 7 miles. Yeah, I mean, it's a distance. It's not unattainable, right, in a day. It's not unattainable. I walk 2.5 miles every morning. It takes me about 42 minutes. And I'm not saying that, wow, what an athlete that dude is. But what I'm trying to imply upon you, so just multiply that 3 times and you've got it, right? You've got the distance from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Now, again, they're doing what while they're walking? Talking. Side point, not the best way to get exercise. Because if you talk while you walk, generally speaking, you don't walk very fast, right? You don't walk very fast. When Rachel and I walk together, that same trek that I take generally pretty much every day, that usually takes about 40 if I'm by myself, takes her and I about 50, because she's got a lot of learning to do along the way when I get those chances. And so my point is, so they're walking and talking. They're not speed walking here. They're at a casual pace as they're walking towards. So they've spent the whole day doing that. Okay, they've spent the vast majority of the day. The night is drawing nigh. The day is far spent. Come on in and stay with us for the night. No reason for you after this day to keep going on. And I chuckle because, yeah, they're right. Right? Think about all that, and again, the vitality, I realize, that comes back into him when he's resurrected, but you consider what's been transpiring, and they just don't know who there is that they're dealing with. They don't know who they're talking to. And so they convince him, in a sense, to stay. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread and blessed it, and broke it, and gave to them. And it was at that moment, the text says, that their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. Now, this is a trick question. When you hear that, where's your mind go? All right? When he institutes his memorial, right? They had come in to partake of the Passover. There's a problem with that, though. What is it? They weren't there. These two men were not part of the apostles. They weren't there in the upper room. And so your mind may jump to that because it sounds very similar, but I would argue the same thing. I don't think that's what they're thinking necessarily, because I don't believe, unless there were somehow, some way we've missed other people being present in the upper room, but Jesus, when he establishes the Lord's Supper, he takes his apostles with him to that scene. And they partake of the Passover. Then he institutes the Lord's Supper. Cleopas was not part of that scene. Now, could you argue that one of those apostles could have had a conversation with Cleopas and the other that was traveling with him? I would make no argument against that. It's absolutely possible that they had a conversation, and that's what sparked and triggered the memory. If they had been told about what Jesus said in that upper room when he memorializes the supper, that might have been. But at any point, for whatever reason, that was the moment. Whether in a sense miraculously, whether intellectually, whether just that memory, whether it was shared with them or however, it's that moment, the text says in Luke's record, that their eyes were opened and they finally what? Finally know who he is. They finally knew him, and then what? He's gone. So Luke records, and again, keep in mind, Luke's not, there's a whole lot of other things that are going to happen after the resurrection of Jesus. And, because he spends several days, right? There's several days from the time of his resurrection before he ascends back to the Father. There's lots of things and encounters. Luke just doesn't really record. He kind of records this one, this moment, but not necessarily some of the others, and others don't acknowledge this. In fact, Luke is he's the only one. Luke is the only of the four gospel records, he's the only one that tells us this story of an event that happens after the resurrection of Jesus. He determined, for whatever reason, and some argue that it might be because of the nationalities of the individuals that are involved, and so you might see Matthew and John's focus be a little different because they were apostles and had a different kind of connectivity to this resurrection scene, as maybe Mark and Luke might be slightly different because they're gaining their knowledge and understanding via other witnesses and various accounts, and may want to share things that maybe Matthew and John wouldn't have the same focus on. But be that as it may, Luke's the only one that records this scene for us. They get to Emmaus finally. Finally, the light bulb goes off. They appreciate finally who it is that they've been talking to all this time. And then he disappears and vanishes out of their sight. And they look to each other and say, "Did not our heart burn within us?" I think sometimes maybe we have more of those moments than we realize. And not in some kind of miraculous way, but just, you know the moment when your heart's telling you, this is what I ought to be doing, this is how I ought to be behaving, this is what I ought to be choosing, this is what I should understand, this is what I do understand. And it's somewhat that resistance, kind of what we were talking about Sunday morning in our sermon when we talked about I knew that, when I know better, do better, that kind of conversation. And that seems to be what happened with these guys. They knew all along this was different. You think about it. I mean, they probably haven't encountered very many individuals who could take them back to Moses and accurately depict for them over what might have been anywhere from a 6 to 7 hour, right, walk along the road to Emmaus. That's a long period of time, and over that span of time, he's talking to them about Moses and the prophets and the manner in which he was able to expound unto them. Let me refresh your memories. It sounds interesting or similar to a much younger Jesus when he was a roughly 12 years old, and he was at the temple, and those chief among the Jews were sitting around listening to him talk, and they said he spoke what? As one that has authority. This is not some common 12-year-old we're dealing with here. He understands things that we don't understand. He grasped the history of our people better than anyone else. And I think that's kind of what's happened all along this road. As these men hear Jesus speaking, they can tell there's something different about how he's expounding this knowledge to us, how he's reminding us of this history. The detail, most likely, that he understood and was able to share with them in ways that they hadn't experienced before outside of Jesus. It should have informed them much quicker. But he said, we should have known. Our hearts were burning while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us Scriptures. He knew them and understood them in ways that they should have understood very quickly who it was they were addressing. Thoughts or questions about that segment? So they rise up, verse 33, the same hour. Interesting. Just a couple of minutes ago, it's not what? It's not safe. Now again, he was going to be by himself, I get that. But a few minutes ago, it's not safe for you to be out on the road. Come on in and stay. Tarry with us, abide with us. You shouldn't be out by yourself. The night is drawing nigh. The day is well spent. You just need to come and spend. I'm going to argue that's most likely because their hearts were burning with the knowledge he was sharing with them. They wanted to hear more. I want to hear more. You come, it constrained him. You stay. But then finally their eyes are opened as to who he actually was. He vanishes out of their sight, and their first instinct is we got to get back to Jerusalem. We got to get back to Jerusalem. We might be some of the earliest witnesses to the resurrection of our Savior. We've got to get back to Jerusalem and let them know. And so they get there. Interesting, it took them all day, slow pace, talking Bible, all the way to Emmaus. Then, when there's a turn of events, they seem to get back to Jerusalem a lot more quickly than they got to Emmaus. So they hustle back to Jerusalem, and they get there, and they found the 11 gathered together, and them that were with them, and saying, the Lord is risen indeed, and hath appeared to Simon. And they told what things were done in the way, and how it was known of them in breaking of bread. They tell the manner in which all of these things have occurred. Now, it's interesting. Who do they mention in verse 34? Simon, who is most commonly Peter, right? We generally, it's kind of a bleed over because other gospel records talk about one of those, the earliest encounters Jesus has was with Simon Peter. And it kind of gets melded in, seemingly, to Luke's record here in this conversation. There's all kinds of things I could chase rabbits with you, but they just do. They just mention him specifically here. Luke does in his record as this encounters. And they just tell the things which were done in the way and how he was known of them in that moment where he broke bread. I suppose it's possible that because you've got two, was he the other that was there, which would clarify, but that doesn't necessarily work with the chronology and other narratives. So I don't have an answer for you, by the way. I don't know why. All of a sudden Luke records for us that these men identified Simon in this process. He doesn't detail that for us. And the problem is he's the only one that outlines anything relating to the trip to Emmaus. So you don't have a parallel to be able to go to kind of give you any clarity as to that. And so we just kind of have to leave it as it is in some ways, though you can go and look and bounce some other things off of some of those other texts. But anyway, just something to think about. And so they basically then just tell the story. They told what things were done in the way, and again how he was known of them in that moment when he broke bread in front of them. We got about a minute and a half. Your thoughts, questions, I'll give it the whole minute and a half. You can have it all.
They've confirmed in 3 days.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't think you're right, Jim. That's not. I don't think that's recorded for us arbitrarily. They make specific mention of that 3-day time span and some concern that we're on day 3 and we haven't what? We haven't seen him yet. So they express some very specific concern about that. But now they become an early witness to the reality that on that 3rd day he was seen. And again, we know, you add all up the other accounts, Mary Magdalene, I believe, is if you look at all of them, she appears to be the first that then encounters Jesus after his resurrection. And then you'll see kind of that slow process of various individuals being added to that number. But again, no single author of the gospel accounts gives us all of what Jesus did after his resurrection. And that's what sometimes makes it difficult, particularly in chronology. And I'll stick to what I've said in the last several weeks as it relates to chronology. If you're looking for a time frame, I think John's record is probably the most accurate from a chronological standpoint. And so if you're trying to look for a time schedule, this happened and this happened and this happened, I think John's the one that focuses on that more. Other writers just kind of tell the story. And I have any problem with that because you and I have done the same thing. Think about the last time you've told a story and you got to step 4 of that account and went, oh, wait. This happened too. And you back people up. Something that may have happened earlier in the chronology, but you're telling it to them later as it comes to mind. So you'll have some of that in the narratives, and we've talked about that in the past.
People like to say this is a discrepancy in the Bible.
And I think that's why you try to do our best to try to harmonize them, but simply because one might give us more detail than another does not mean they're out of harmony with each other. I might tell you and I might share the same story of something, but not necessarily share all the same details or same picture of that event.